Distinguished panelists and dear participants, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to a nice webinar on maritime dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflict are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Today's program is being organized by Security and Strategic Studies Center under the Indo-Pacific Affairs Program, which is one of the major research topics at NICE. The Indo-Pacific region has emerged as a major center for geostrategic interest. As a political and strategic concept, it has gradually established in the foreign policy action for some countries, especially the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. This has further widened the scope. The research topic focuses on Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. To talk on the very important topic of today, we have Captain Sarabjit Parmar. I got to meet Captain Parmar when I was working at Institute of Defence Studies and Analyses, New Delhi. Captain Parmar is an alumnus of National Defence Academy, Kharakwasla, and Defence Service Staff College, Wellington. Captain Parmar was commissioned into the Indian Navy on 1st of July 1987. He is a Sea King pilot who has commanded 2 ships and a frontline Sea King Squadron. He was a member of the 11th Indian Antarctica Summer Expedition in 1991 and has attended the South Asia Regional Governance and Management Defense course conducted by the British government at Colombo in 2005. He represented the Indian Navy in the first international HOSTAC helicopter operation from ships other than aircraft carrier conference held at Norfolk, United States in 2008. He has served as Joint Director Naval Plans in Directorate of Naval Planning at IHQ Ministry of Defence Navy. He has been Director Staff at Defence College Staff College, Wellington, where he was responsible for the National Strategy and International Law modules. As a research fellow at the Institute of Defence Studies and Analyses, New Delhi from September 2010 to July 2014, he has written on maritime security aspects and presented a paper on various national and international conferences. Post IDSA, he was Director of Strategy in the Directorate of Strategic Concepts and Transformation at IHQ Ministry of Defence Navy from July 2014 to April 2016, where as part of the core team revised and published the Indian Navy's unclassified Maritime Security Strategy, ensuring secure seas, Indian Maritime Security Strategy of 2015, and Indian Maritime Doctrine. From April 2016 to April 2018, at the Maritime Doctorate and Concept Center, as Director of Strategic Maritime Assessment and Doctrine Development, he carried out regional maritime assessment and completed the Doctrine Development Plan. He has written extensively on maritime security issues and is pursuing PhD at Mumbai University. His thesis will examine the evolving maritime security architecture template of the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific regions. He joined National Maritime Foundation as a senior fellow in April 2018 and took over as executive director on 4th June 2019. Once again, I would like to welcome Captain Parmar. Sir, you will have around 30 to 40 minutes to make your presentation, which will be followed by question and answers. I'd like to request all our participants to type their questions in the Zoom chat room or under the Facebook Live. Thank you, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pramod, for those kind words. And it's wonderful seeing you once again after a long time. If I do remember, a beer is due. So thank you very much for those kind words. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen from New Delhi. And it's a daunting task, Pramod, that has asked me to speak on today, maritime dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. The region itself is huge. The dynamics itself are complex and intense and varied. So what I plan to do in around 40 odd minutes with Pramod's indulgence, I will try to cover a vast ambit, and we will leave a lot of time for question and answers, but I hope I'll be able to cover more ground later on. So first of all, you must remember that Indo-Pacific is not a very old concept or a thought process. Earlier, it used to be called the Asia-Pacific. So it's important to understand the transition that happened from the term Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, and what were the major changes that came along with it, if there were any, if we would like to look at it that way also. So if we look at it, I've put it down in sort of chronological order. The main I'd say, milestones or decisive points in the military parlance to look at how did this come by. So I take you back to 2007, where the former Prime Minister of Japan visited the Indian Parliament, and he made his famous speech, and he spoke of the confluence of, let me minimize this window on the right, thank you, confluence of the Indian and Pacific Oceans as the dynamic coupling as seas of freedom and of prosperity in broader Asia. There, of course, there have been very many references to the term Indo-Pacific thereafter, but I think this was the first utterance. And what I'm going to talk is statements made at the highest levels of governance, which actually are important to my mind to the framing of this term. And then, of course, in Hillary Clinton in November 2011, in an article in Foreign Affairs, qualified and quantified, as you like put it, Asia Pacific, as far as the US concerned, was from the Indian subcontinent to the western shores of Americas. Now, in a broader term concept, during the mid of 2000 or around this time period between 2007-2011, US was struggling between pivot and rebalance. And also it was, the thought process was that as far as Asia Pacific was concerned, in most of the, or through the lens of many nations, it was east of Malacca Strait. Indian Ocean region was looked at as a separate entity into itself, and therefore there was little reference to Indian Ocean region as part of Asia Pacific. But this statement extended from Strait of Malacca onto the Indian subcontinent, which meant the western part of the Indian Ocean region was still left out of the debate. Then in 2012, the United States Strategic Guidance document came out with a very interesting a sentence that said the US economic and security interests are inextricably linked to developments in the arc extending from the Western Pacific and East Asia into the Indian Ocean region and South Asia. So when you looked at the Indian Ocean region, it meant that this had expanded. But yet there was not too much of interest in looking at the Indian Ocean region as an intrinsic part of the Indo-Pacific or the developing term, or Asia Pacific as is predominant at that point in time. Then, of course, when Obama took over, he was faced with a few problems. One was convincing his allies that yes, US would stand by them. And then, of course, there was the issue of return to Asia, pivot to Asia, and then the rebalance subsequently. But the pivot holds merit to an understanding that when you read the number of articles and statements that came out, one of them stands out where it says when US meant pivots to Asia, it included the Indian Ocean and many coastal states therein. Still ambiguous and not very clear. Australia in its 2013 White Defence paper made one of the first references, as far as what I have been able to find out, is, and the statement in the White Defence paper is, a new Indo-Pacific strategic arc is beginning to emerge, connecting the Indian and Pacific Oceans through Southeast Asia. Now, when you look through Southeast Asia, that is an area of importance for Australia. And if I put it in another parlance, Southeast Asia also contains ASEAN. There has been talk and debate about ASEAN centrality as far as Indo-Pacific goes. And of course, I will have a little reference to that a little later. As far as India is concerned, in 2018, the first reference as such to Indo-Pacific term from the highest office was made by Prime Minister Modi. The Shangri-La Dialogue, when he says, as far as India is concerned, the Indo-Pacific stretches from the shores of Africa to that of the Americas. So as of now, what we see is that we're still looking at a geographical entity, which varies as far as the perception of various nations go. And then, of course, in 2019, ASEAN came out with its ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. I referred to this in my earlier slide, but this outlook itself concentrates on the centrality of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific. And there's a lot of debate on this, where the ASEAN centrality still stands, what is the importance, and whether it can actually be the foundation stone of anything with the Indo-Pacific. But when you talk about the Indo-Pacific to anybody, there are three words that immediately hit you: free, open, and inclusive. So all the statements from various nations, you'll find a combination of either three or all three, or maybe one of them. But generally, you'll have free, open, and in some instances, you'll have free, open, inclusive. So the understanding for the Indo-Pacific is that this is a free area, it's open for all, and it is inclusive, it is not exclusive. Then, of course, the the Chinese debate comes out is that they say that anything which anybody does, they look at it as against China, and therefore there are objections to various phrases, terminologies, and statements that come from various nations. Having said that, I thought the best way to look at the Indo-Pacific to have a look at certain strategies and policies that have been issued by various nations, including Germany, which is the latest one, and have a look at them. Now, these strategies and policies are very broad-based, but I'll try to flesh out the maritime constructs and the linkages from them. So the Indo-Pacific since 2007 till date, and that's 13 years, it's going to be almost short of a decade and a half, has generated a lot of interest for a variety of reasons. And at this point, I'd like to make a statement that I always say, that nations will view the environment, international laws, conventions, understandings based on realpolitik, which is in the interest of their national interests. And that is something that is a thread we see when we look at the various strategies and policies. So let's look at the USA first. So there are two that I've taken out. I've not looked at the national security strategies that are broad-based, but I thought these are a little more specific and needed mention. One is the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, or ARIA, of 2018, and the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report of 2019. France, I've had a look at France and security in the Indo-Pacific, the 2018 edition, which replaced the 2016 edition. Australia, I've had a look at the Defence Strategic Update of 2020. As far as Japan is concerned, it is based, the Indo-Pacific policy or viewpoint or outlook is based on structural factors, and that's very interesting, and that will come about when we have a look at Japan. Germany is the latest entry after France, the second European nation to come out with some sort of a document on the Indo-Pacific. They don't call it a strategy, they call it policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific 2020. So far, I've only the English translation of the executive summary is available. We are awaiting the English translation of the main document, which I'm sure would make interesting reading. And as far as India is concerned, I would take a look at the Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative 2019. So this you can see is over a period of time, and I've just taken the last 2 years because it is an update and gives us a sort of a relation between what's happening on ground and what has and is the thought process of nations. China, I have not mentioned in this, but we'll be discussing China in depth when I look at maritime maneuvering. So first of all, what is the ARIA? It's very interesting because it took some time for it to come through. My understanding and reading is that the issue of money was one main area. There was one more act before this that did not see light of day. But 2018, finally, this act was passed, and it establishes a multifaceted US strategy to increase US security, economic interest, and values in the Indo-Pacific region. So the focus is on US interests, and of course, it also allies and strategic partners. The money involved is around $1.5 billion US for various whatever projects the US has in mind with its strategic, with its allies and strategic partners. So the Act looks at relations with various nations. I've noted India, China, ASEAN, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan as the main ones. There is, of course, reference to other nations. And it looks at working with allies and partners. There is mention of conduct of joint maritime training, which is already in force with some certain nations. Relationships are being developed with many others. And then, of course, the sum of $1.5 billion would have to be judiciously used. It looks at FONOPs with allies and partners, and would remind you that the visit of the Australian Foreign Minister to USA, where the Foreign Minister said very clearly that Australia is acting in the best interest as it deems fit. I'd asked this question as to what was the meaning of it, and it came around to the fact that it was centered around FONOPs, that Australia, my understanding is, may not toe the US line in toto. There is a word of supporting the code of conduct in the South China Sea insofar as US friends are concerned. And of course, there is talk of the support of a rules-based international system, which of course is the bedrock of all debates, is that a rules-based, international rules-based order is under jeopardy and it is being challenged. Insofar as the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report is concerned, It again speaks of a free and open Indo-Pacific, two of the three words which I had mentioned earlier. It looks at China as a revisionist power with military modernization and coercive actions as the main center of focus of this strategy. It looks at North Korea, rogue state. The impact of North Korea in the Indo-Pacific may be limited only towards the East Asian side, but whatever it is still an issue that needs to be looked at. And as more and more nations sail into the South China Sea and East China Sea and the Western Pacific, this is an issue they may have to contend with, because they will be looked upon as part of the coterie that is against North Korea, and if you want to say that, China too. It looks at enhanced joint force preparedness with the allies. There is specific talk of Australia and Japan, of course, other nations out there, which means that they are looking at, and if you link this with ARIA, then of course you can join the two together and see that there is a game plan there. How much it moves forward is yet to be seen. Some of it is already in action. Cooperation is an interesting part. Now here again, there is a caveat that emerges from this strategy, which is all of sharing responsibilities and burdens. And in my conversations with my US colleagues, there is a feeling that the allies and strategic partners should be able to also take on certain amount of responsibility and burden and not let US take the whole weight itself. In this case, I would like to perhaps knock on the doors of something which we called offshore balancing some point time back, and a neo-Nixon doctrine. Maybe these two, the strategy and the ARIA combined together, may be working on those lines where they want their strategic allies and partners to be able to look after themselves in their respective areas, insofar as responsibilities and sharing of burdens go. Of course, with India, there was an expanding partnership spoken with India, and this report is of June 2019. The date is 1st June, and in September 2019, India and US signed the COMCASA. It's not that this strategy report helped it in any way, because the discussions were on for a long time. It only cemented the views, and I take you back to sort of enhanced joint force preparedness with the allies and the second part of cooperation, which perhaps resulted in this. As far as France is concerned, this is a snapshot from their 2018 document, and this shows the presence of French citizens and French people in Indo-Pacific. The background of this is that France has said it has always been an Indian Ocean nation, and that is why it has entry in IONS, and it's also a dialogue partner in IORA for that matter. But it has a significant French presence in the Indo-Pacific, and that is the bedrock of its defense and security policy in Indo-Pacific. This, of course, the 2018 version updated the 2016 version, and going by that, maybe this year we will be seeing a new edition. It dictates the French defense and security policy. I've already outlined the background for this. It looks at engaging partners, and France has been looking at India. We also have a maritime exercise with them for a long time. And under engaging partners, it looks at maritime security. It's a very broad-based term as it is, but it needs to be fleshed out. And this is something that France would need to do if it needs to actually see this document of it, or this policy work out. Interesting, it looks at environmental security, which is a part and parcel of maritime security in itself and is an important issue. It looks at protecting global commons. It also looks at building military capacity and capability of its strategic partners. And when we look at Germany, now this is an interesting aspect out here. Germany is the second nation to come out, or European nation to come out, as I said, with Indo-Pacific guidelines, they call it. They don't call it a strategy. But for a long time, Germany has been trying to put a ship that would be available in the Indo-Pacific or Indian Ocean region round the clock for, I think if I remember correctly, around 2 years, but that has still not worked out. Insofar as France and Germany goes, France has its bases in the Indian Ocean region, so it should not have a problem in the IOR. But when Germany enters, and when it also both the nations extend their sea legs into the Western Pacific region, starting say east of Malacca, it would be able to look at sustainability and also maintain a presence there with the minimum breakdown, and also look at supplying its ship or assets in this area. So therefore, it needs to look at various friendly nations and ports. I'm sure there would be a discussion with nations on this, but this is important, especially where Germany is concerned. There's some interesting pointers that I found. I've just gone through it briefly. It is as I said, the translation of the executive summary. The main document, the translation is awaited, but there are certain statements that hit you totally. One is that the document very clearly states that the Indo-Pacific region is not clearly delineated in geographic terms. That's again because there is a different perception, as I discussed earlier, in how the world looks at the Indo-Pacific region. It says there are various definitions, which is absolutely correct, but it goes ahead to say it's not very clear. When you say Indian Pacific Oceans, how many rim nations are you going to include? Are you going to include, for example, the Persian Gulf or not? Are you going to include the Red Sea in this or not? To my mind, as far as Germany and France are concerned, the Red Sea is important because that is the stretch of water from which their ships will enter after exiting the Suez Canal. It looks at the Indo-Pacific as an area of considerable economic growth with a very youthful population. But it also goes to say that there are opportunities for cooperation in this. Now, this is the view it has of the area, and that's the economic part of it. But the other area is opportunities for cooperation. And of course, overall, it says that it looks to contributing to a future overall EU strategy. Now, the question here is that when EU nations enter the Indo-Pacific, France has come, is here only, it's present here. Do they come as the nations of France, Germany, or any other nation, or will they come as EU nations? Now, that remains to be seen how the EU would be able to come out with an Indo-Pacific strategy. It speaks of principles and initiatives. I'll not go into the depth of it because I have a little shortage of time, but I would definitely request, especially interested people who look at EU and nations interested in the Indo-Pacific, to have a look at it. It makes interesting reading. But there's a problem here. If you actually want to make a difference or have your presence felt in the Indo-Pacific, boots on ground, as the military says, or as I've put here, presence is required. A strategy without follow-on actions or presence is, to my mind, dead. And therefore, Germany, if it wishes to extend its policy into action, it should make its presence felt, and the sooner the better. It's come out with this strategy in this month itself, this guidelines, and therefore it needs to be seen what are the follow-on actions Germany will take. Australia, looking at the strategic 2020 defense update, the document talks about strengthening regional engagement across the Indo-Pacific. It also says there's a possibility of high intensity conflict is unlikely, but less or more or lesser remote than the earlier 2016 document which they had said. So they are looking at the possibility. And my second last slide may explain it all, is this a powder keg we are all sitting on? It looks at the high rate of military modernization. It looks at an increase in gray zone activities. Now, this is an issue that requires to be looked at in detail, because this is where lawfare is gaining traction. And I always say nobody does it better than China. We have a lot of lessons to learn from them. Conflict. So these two issues, increase in gray zone activities and coercion, is obviously centered on Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea and in the broader area of the Indo-Pacific. I've mentioned this economic coercion. Australia has also suffered it, and therefore for it, it's a point to be mentioned. But it says that the US-China relations and ongoing problems between both the nations are going to be the main driver of various dynamics, and maritime is one of them. And I'll explain that when I look at, or it'll become clearer when I look at maritime maneuverings. And overall, it says it could lead to instability. The question is, how stable is the Indo-Pacific right now? If you look at it in a whole area, then as an average point, it's quite stable. In fact, the Chinese in their Asia-Pacific strategic strategy document, I'm forgetting the year it was, very clearly said that the Asia-Pacific is a stable area. Now, that was, I think, around 3 to 4 years back. Japan, structural factors is what I had said. 2007 was the first mention that, now this is all driven by Prime Minister. after, or rather before he of Quad, sort of a loose sort of from that or of any value today right now. And then, of course, between 2000 to 2012, Japan saw the change of, I think, around 5 prime ministers, if I remember correctly. And in 2012, Abe once again brought out a similar concept, but with a different name, which he called the democratic. I'm forgetting which journal. And he together and look at safeguarding the maritime commerce from Iowa to the Western Pacific. Further, in 2014, during the Shangri-La Dialogue, he spoke about the interconnectedness of the Pacific and Indian Ocean. So he's been at it since 2007. And in this, certain points he brought out was aspect of UNCLOS here based on international law to drive these claims. So therefore, what will Japan still follow the path that Abe has laid out to establish the Quad, to have some sort of semblance of rule in the Indo-Pacific? That is yet to be seen. If Japan cannot follow the path which is there, then the Quad itself is under question. And then, of course, there are other issues connected with it that will become weaker for stability in the Indo-Pacific region. As far as India is concerned, Prime Minister Modi on the 14th East Asia Summit in 2019 mentioned something called the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. It's based on 7 pillars. The first is security, ecology, resources. The list is there. All of them in some way or the other have a connect to the maritime environment. This is still an initiative. It is being pushed vigorously by the Indian establishment, and hopefully we should be able to connect the IPOI with India's concept of Sagar, Act East policy, and of course an interest in the Indo-Pacific. Yesterday, interestingly, was the first trilateral between Australia, France, and India. And Australia had mentioned this, I think, a couple of months back, saying that we should have a look at it. And you would also remember that when the French carrier was going to come in, it was supposed to be escorted by Australian ships, and vice versa. French ships should also be escorting Australia. There was a comment from Australia that India should also get involved. So perhaps we are looking at, can't even call it a Quad, but maybe we are looking at a Quad Plus in the future. There has been talk of a Quad Plus, which includes the 4 nations in the Quad and plus a few more. Maybe France is one. Vietnam could be another. That is yet to be seen. But the interesting part is in this trilateral yesterday, there was a discussion between the foreign secretaries of 3 nations on Indo-Pacific social, economic, and geostrategic challenges. And more importantly, there was talk on cooperation on marine global commons. So this is insofar as what I would try to place in perspective, the look at the maritime dynamics as far as important nations are concerned. There are many more, but for lack of time, we can take that on. I thought a snapshot by a recent collection of writings on this is by a gentleman, Dr. Stephen Nagy, when he looked at maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So if you'll follow my cursor, you'll find RIMPAC is one multilateral, Shangri-La is one multilateral. The rest you will find that the nations more or less are common, and the one that stand out is Japan, Australia, India, US. Again, there is a sort of a Quad-centric approach in maritime cooperation out here. And of course, there is the type of activities and name of activities. But I throw up one issue for debate, is that can we make the Malabar series of exercises, which is done essentially between India, US, and Japan, as the Indo-Pacific maritime flag bearer? I know RIMPAC is also there, but this is essentially because this is a stretch over, say, from 1995, from where we started, up to 2014. The 2016 Malabar series of exercises was off Sasebo in the Western Pacific region out here, and the 2018 was off Guam. So you can see that it is more concentrated in the Western Pacific here, but I'll bring your notice to September 2007 Malabar, or Malabar 02 as it was called. There are 5 flags here. I was fortunate to be active part of this exercise. I was commanding the helicopter squadron on the Indian aircraft carrier Virat. And although there are 5 nations here, we always miss out one more. And we had one Royal Naval ship with us. So there was 6 nations and 25 ships. This, I think, is something that can be replicated. It is an established practice. As of now, it's between India, Japan, and the US. Australia has been seeking entry for some time. Perhaps maybe we will eventually open the doors. The doors will be open to Australia. But to my mind, I think we need to look at the Malabar series of exercises as central to Indo-Pacific maritime security. So let's have a look at maritime maneuverings. The interesting map I came across while I was looking for material. And this is, again, it is part of the same document in which Dr. Stephen Nagy had written an article. And this is an article by Vice Admiral Ota Fumio from Japan. And this is from the Global Times. It's a 2014 snapshot. And this looks at estimated Chinese naval overseas bases and ports in the next 10 years. Admiral Ota Fumio calls it as the BRI roadmap and says that this is a PLA project. He calls it a PLA project. So there are various nations out here which have been named. And this was maybe a roadmap stretching from Western Pacific, South China Sea, Indian Ocean region, and on to the western coast of Africa, where obviously Chinese interests are there. The ones, we have to add Vanuatu to this. It's not mentioned in the initial one, so I added it myself. The ones I've marked in red are, to my mind, the ports over which China has some degree of control or has a deeper vested interest. Call it what you like. The ones in black are those in which are not so much under their control, but could be used. Of course, Hambantota, Sri Lanka has very clearly said that it is not a part of, China has no involvement in it. And to prove a point, in April, they had conducted exercise with the US forces of Hambantota. So this is the roadmap. And so when we are looking at this, we will see from where China goes as far as its overseas bases or places, as we oft call it. Another interesting part I'd bring to your notice out here is the mention of 3 theaters. Yeah. So this theater, which is marked out here, is obviously the Pacific. This theater here is the Indian Ocean region. And this theater here is the African region. The first time I'm seeing this map, I was quite intrigued by it, and it's quite interesting. And those of you who are interested can contact me. I can give you the link to these articles. I think it was just published recently. So it's all a question of balance of power at the end of the day, is that who is going to be the #1 nation. I'm fond of quoting Dina Zins in the definition of balance of power. There are many. Particular distribution of power among the states of a system such that no single state and no existing alliance has an overwhelming or preponderant amount of power. Of course, this is an idealistic definition. It may not hold true, but when you look at balance of power, you must remember the other side of the coin is something called power transition. This is a diagram for a 1958 textbook. I think it defines it very well, where you have 4 categories of nations: small powers, middle powers, great powers, dominant nation. You have a line which is dynamic. It can shift up and down depending upon the area and the dynamics existing. On one side, you have the dissatisfied nations. On the other side, you have satisfied nations. And dissatisfied nations are always trying to cross the line to come out to satisfied nations, and satisfied nations always try to maintain in this area, or they're happy where they are. So there's certain hierarchies, and this is my thought process, that if I put India in the Indian Ocean region on the border of a middle and great power, and in the Western Pacific region as a middle power. Now, a middle power is a nation that is able to influence events in that particular region to a moderate to great degree. And in China, I would say in the Western Pacific region, it's a middle with great power leanings and dominant nation aspirations. And in the Indian Ocean region, it's a middle power with great power aspirations. Please note the word aspirations. Japan in the Western Pacific region, I would place in the border of a middle and great power. And when it comes to the US, in both the regions, I would say it's a great power with dominant nation status. The dominant nation tag per se, I don't think it exists any longer, but there's a status on this. And that status essentially is dependent on alliances, coalitions, and strategic partnerships. That's why for China, I called it aspirations, because without any great alliances or strategic nations by its side, it will be difficult for it to gain the tag of dominant nation. And I think as far as the US is concerned, John Mattis in his resignation letter very clearly said that while the US remains an indispensable nation in the free world, we cannot protect our interests or serve that role effectively without maintaining strong alliances and show respect to those allies. So this is a very clear indication, and I take you back to the point I made some time back where Obama, when he was office, was for a great deal was concentrating on assuring his allies, especially Japan and South Korea, that the US will be there for them. Something the US stresses very frequently nowadays. So if I put US here and say dominant nation status, and I say, all right, India and Japan are between middle and great paths, slowly plodding their way up. They're not in a great hurry to reach, say, between here or wherever they decide to reach, but they will eventually reach there. And I put China closer to a little rung above both the nations, and this is what China is trying to do. And therefore, the Indo-Pacific today is focused on the assertiveness of China, China-US relations, which the Australian document brought out very clearly. And therefore, it's all a question of either reacting to China or attempting to be proactive to what China is doing. So take you to the South China Sea. So just to give you an example of certain maritime maneuverings and how it's looking at, and this is a map that shows you which nation is holding how many islands. After the Philippines arbitration which went in Philippines' favor, China went for a change of tack. Instead of looking at say maritime zones, because it rejected the arbitration and it also rejected the court saying that it does not have any standards loci on even judging the case because it's a question of sovereignty. So when you look at this, when you look at it, China has got 4 shark claims. And therefore, it is looking at sovereignty over 4 island groups. That is Pratas here, Macclesfield Bank, the main Spratly Island, and of course Paracel Zisha, over which it already has a very strong hold. And it very clearly also states that it reserves the right of defending these nations, and it's made its statements very clear. So having a look at Woody Island, and how is it going to do this? How are the maritime maneuvering? It's already operating its ships within the in the South China Sea. So Woody Island is something, the snapshot of 28 March 2018. See the facilities that have developed. This is Ferry Cross Reef, June 16, 2017, and a snapshot of May 2018. Mischief Reef, and there's a reason why I'm looking at these islands. It will come in the subsequent slides. It's again 2017. Please follow the cursor. See this area here. This is the entry. There is a lot of anchorage space here with enough depth for ships to come, and it sort of gives the ships protection from the elements. Remember, South China Sea is frequently hit by typhoons. And this is a snapshot of May 2018. Subi Reef, May 4th, 2017. Again, note this entry out here and see the color of this different from its clear indication. You can already see some vessels here. And so therefore, this will also give vessels and ships protection. The length of the runways are adequate for operating various aircraft that are in the inventory of China. This is a snapshot of May 2018. So, arming of islands. A lot of nations are calling it arming of islands, and the question is asking China as to what are you doing with them. I had mentioned these islands, that's why to give the examples of Mischief Reef, Subi, Ferry Cross, and Woody Island. And if it positions, and it is already positioned, enough military assets there, then we are looking at something like this. So if it operates aircraft, say, from any of these islands, right, then you can see that it has got the whole area of importance of South China Sea, including the entry-exit points from the various straits that crisscross this area out here. If I add an air-to-air refueler, then of course this line will extend much outwards. Got the whole area under surveillance. Some trying to establish some sort of surveillance control over this area. knowing who is where doing what. Now, why does it do this? Before that, I will put in a word for the anti-ship ballistic missiles, especially after the recent missile firing that took place in South China Sea, and China claims that it is a success. The anti-ship ballistic missile raised its head way back in 95-96. The first mention of it was during the Taiwan Strait crisis, when, of course, there was a number of missile firings across the straits, and of course, the US sailed into carrier strike groups. The importance of carriers is well known. The first question a US president asks in a time of crisis is, where is the nearest carrier strike group? And therefore, two carrier strike groups apparently sailed in. Now, there are two different stories available here. One story says that the carrier groups sailed through the straits. Just follow the cursor, please. Here, sailed through here. Another narrative says that they didn't enter this area. And the narratives have counter arguments on both sides. As to why the carrier strike group did not enter the straits was it was not sure whether China would carry out its threat of swarming tactics against the carrier, something the Iranians have been now threatening for some time in the, or using, or threatening to use in the Persian Gulf, and therefore the group didn't go through. The other narrative is that the carrier strike groups indeed went through the strait, but China was not very sure should it do something or not. So that is the story of 95-96. But thereafter, the Chinese decided that something needs to be done. It does not have a counter for against the American carriers. One of the biggest fears China has is being attacked once again, and therefore it fears brutes on ground. Any nation would do that in any case, and China always quotes a century of humiliation towards that. So therefore, they came up with the ASBM. This is a pictorial depiction of the ranges. As you can see, even in the IOR, they've got this much covered. And I always say, if I want to stretch an argument, let's assume for once that the Chinese put a battery of ASBMs in Godard. Can you imagine the area they would cover subsequently? But that is just to stretch the argument for interest's sake. So now there is a concept called A2AD, anti-access area denial. So is the ASBM a balancer, and does it help China's A2AD? Now, please remember, A2AD is a Western concept. It's not a Chinese concept. A lot of concepts that the US or the Western or the academics throughout the world look at is based on Western narratives, but the Chinese have a different look at it. One error we all make is that we assume that the Chinese would be thinking in the same fashion when they don't. So just to remind you, anti-access is to deny entry into the area, and area denial is once in the area, prevent the adversary from maneuvering into a position of advantage. The Chinese have something in their lexicon called ASCEL, or active strategic counterattacks on exterior lines. I was fortunate to have an interaction with the Academy of Military Sciences, Beijing. They are the organization that comes out with this, and I had a very nice chat with the general who had come, and he said that very few people actually look at China from China's viewpoint. And one reason is that especially those who study China do not know Mandarin. I'm one of them. Get by with translations from here and there. So therefore, if you need to understand China, you need or read what their thought process is. You actually have to read their writings in Mandarin. So this ASCL is a strategic and not at an operational level. It is conducted throughout the conflict, and the idea is to have the conflict as far away from the Chinese mainland, so the Chinese mainland is not attacked. Bring you back to the test firing that the Chinese did of the ASBM recently in the South China Sea. They were fired from quite inward from the coast, landward of the coast, into certain depth. So therefore, even if you want to take out the ASBMs, you would need to travel that far over air defense of China to get at those missiles. That's something that we need to look at. And therefore, it is also asymmetric against a superior adversary. It is a counterattack, remember. Therefore, it is reactive. And China will, to my mind, will never look at firing the first shot. It may coerce somebody else to do so. And that is where I say, as far as lawfare is concerned, this is a lesson we need to learn from the Chinese. And the main area of this would be between the first and second island chain. The first island chain is just towards the edge of Malaysia. Down then second island chain comes down towards Guam. The third includes Hawaii. There is talk of a fourth and fifth island chain also in the IOR, fourth being running north-south from Hambantota and up to Karachi, and the fifth along the eastern coast of Africa. But that is still, again, not the Chinese thought process. Far as intentions are concerned, it's looking at strategic depth, push out the enemy as far as the adversary as far as possible, to offer to the mainland one, and if it territory, that buffer increases. There is talk of encirclement and isolation of Taiwan. There's a lot of talk going about it. There have been a lot of incidences or issues between China and Taiwan recently. One was the aircraft which is apparently shot down. Both China and Taiwan have denied it, but there is problems in this region, especially around Taiwan. There's a training ground and springboard for power projection beyond the first island chain. It has already punctured the first island chain, as I've explained to you, and if they manage to operate outside the second island chain, and if they manage to keep their adversaries outside the first island chain, they would have achieved one of their major aims, and therefore they will be free to maneuver in the maritime domain as much as they can. And then, of course, there's the issue of energy and trade, protection of resources and stocks, and that's a separate debate unto itself. So, and Pramod, I think I have promised you 35-40 minutes. It's a very broad brush. It's very difficult to explain the whole thing of it. So today is actually, are we sitting on a powder keg? Is the Indo-Pacific central region or the South China Sea? Because do remember, when a powder keg explodes, there will be shrapnel and debris that are going to fall way beyond. And one issue out here is there is debate that the manner in which, say, China behaves in the South China Sea is not the manner in which it behaves outside the South China Sea. But there have been cases where we are seeing a replication of the assertiveness of China coming outside the region. So as Australia said, there is instability, and the possibility of a high intensity conflict is maybe reducing. With that, I stop. And have I clocked 35-40 minutes, Pramod?
Yes, sir. It's like 30-35 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your enlightening presentation. It was very comprehensive and I learned a lot. I still remember your presentation on South China Sea at IDSA, I think around 2010 or even before that. I started following South China Sea only after listening to you, and it was very interesting. Let's move to the questions, because there are lots of questions. We have got around 30 in different platforms. In chat room, I think there are 7 or 8. There'll be many popping up in few minutes. So let's move to the first question. What role does maritime security in the Indo-Pacific can play in de-escalating the India's current tension with China?
I'm talking the border problem.
Yes, border problem.
Okay. So it's there has been talk of interlinking maritime domain with the border issue. It needs to be done, to my mind, yes, but there are problems there right now. Is that you must remember, the moment a ship crosses the territorial seas, all right, or for the matter, even if it leaves harbor, it is entering a domain where a variety of international laws and conventions will apply. And the moment it is outside the territorial seas, the amount of degree of control of the maritime zone or by the coastal state reduces phenomenally. All right. So if we are to say, look at, let's take a hypothetical case of, say, countering China in the Indian Ocean region should it enter. As of now, it will be nothing more than what we call monitoring or surveilling or tagging along, so that they know we are present and we are aware of their movements there. China has its Indian Ocean region. It is not very strong right now, because any navy or any fleet that sails inherently needs a good degree of air cover. The further it goes away from land, and especially in China's case, once a month it sails through the Malacca Strait, it is devoid of any air cover from land. Unless, of course, it is able to position its aircraft in some friendly nation's airfield, or even for fueling and come that far, but it will be a very tedious effort. So a lot of it would depend upon the cover given by aircraft from the aircraft carrier. So till the time, to my mind, this is again my view, till the time China's aircraft carriers do not become fully operational and are a threat to be considered, Till that time, we will not have too much of a problem with China in the Indian Ocean region. Submarines is a separate issue, but there are steps and methods in place to counter that. Insofar as with the land border is concerned, I don't think China will like to link up the maritime issue with the land border, because as I said, it's weak in the Indian Ocean region. For that matter, when we enter the South China Sea, we have the same problems. But it needs to be looked at. We cannot let our guard down, and therefore we need to be very careful as to what anybody is up to in the maritime domain.
There's another question that the much discussed canal across southern Thailand's it's Isthmus. It's an island in Thailand. The narrowest point of the Malaya Peninsula would open a second sea route with China to the Indian Ocean. How would this impact China-India maritime dynamics?
First of all, this Kra Isthmus keeps raising its head every 3 or 4 years, right? And as far as what I have read and understood, Thailand is not for it, for the simple reason, the moment you put a natural divide across, there are problems for that nation which border on sectarian issues, or maybe major sectarian issues for that matter. So I don't see the Kra Isthmus coming about. However, there is a linkage from one port from the other side to the port on the Andaman Nicobar side through road and rail, but that is not going to let ships come through. So if we like to stretch the argument and say that if the Kra Isthmus does come along, then yes, the maritime security issues in the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal will increase, because the quantum of shipping which will come through that Kra Isthmus may be equal to the quantum of shipping that will come through Malacca. Any ship that comes through Malacca and wishes to enter the Bay of Bengal would rather come through the Kra Isthmus. Now, what would be the percentage of ships that come through the Kra Isthmus? Maybe not as equal to, so I correct myself, may not be equal to the amount of shipping coming through the Malacca Strait, but given the maritime geography and the number of islands in the Andaman Sea and in the Bay of Bengal, India's maritime is monitoring, and I hope that answers the question.
There's another interesting question. Like America has been saying that Indo-Pacific is not aimed at anyone. It is a rule-based approach for free and fair Indo-Pacific. In Beijing, there is one section who advocates that China should be part of Indo-Pacific because it is their own backyard, what they call Asia-Pacific. And their presence in Indo-Pacific will cause them less damage. Forget about China at the moment, but what will be the impact of Indo-Pacific if Russia joins it?
I think Russia is already there. Again, you see, again, this is the, I mean, the person who's asked the question, I bring to your notice what I had said, that it's a geographic area. It is not a club. It is not exclusive. It is not aimed at against anybody. The definitions vary. You've seen what Germany's policy guidelines say. So let's look at it as a geographical area. Let's not look at it as an organization. There's no organization called Indo-Pacific. To my mind, you cannot have an organization like called the Indo-Pacific, because if you look from the eastern coast of Africa to the western shores of America, you can even imagine how many nations will get involved, including landlocked. Let's forget only maritime. So it's a geographical region. To look at it as aimed at somebody else is an interpretation or a perception of that particular nation. So Russia is already there. It's already sailed through. It's already done exercises with China of the Sea of Ox north of Japan. It's done it in South China Sea. One or two of them have been amphibious exercises, which rang some warning bells for some nations. I think 2012, 2013, something we covered in IDSA promote at that point in time. So Russia is already there. And if you advocate free and open and inclusive and also say freedom of navigation, nobody has the right to stop anybody from transiting the area or even being there for that matter.
There's another question like, what will be the impact on Indo-Pacific strategy with the end of Abe's era in Japan?
Now the question is, which Indo-Pacific strategy? The Japanese one, I assume. So that's the question I asked, is that it is still yet to unfold. Now what's going to happen? Starting from 2007 with Quad 1, with the strategic diamond, and then if we call this Quad 2.0, is Japan going to follow one? Will his successor have the same steam to pursue it? That is yet to be seen. Based on that will hinge the future of Japan's Indo-Pacific policy.
There's another similar, you said like who's Indo-Pacific. There's two questions, I'm trying to club them together. Like US has America's first policy, India has neighborhood first, and you are aware of China and Pakistan. Oh, no, I think that's different. I'll club that together. One is like, do all the Quad countries agree on the strategy of Indo-Pacific? Like, because it is said that different countries of Quad have different concepts of Indo-Pacific. So how do it overlap?
That, to my mind, is the main issue. Till the time you don't come to a consensus of an understanding what you mean by the Indo-Pacific, nothing can take off. Whether you call it Quad, whether you call it anything else, or even for that matter, for the trilateral, we're not privy to all the discussions. But if you do not have convergence on an understanding on, say, Indo-Pacific 1, what do you mean by Indo-Pacific? Is the geographical area the same? Would you look at the dynamics in the same, from the same lens? Right? Would you look at the debate on supporting the existing rules-based order in the same lens, right? So if India looks at, say, neighborhood first, ASEAN looks at ASEAN centrality, American interest is America first, all nations will look at the national interest first. So there needs to be a consensus on maximum issues which come under the ambit of Indo-Pacific if you want to go ahead. Otherwise, we can continue having webinars and discussing.
So there is one that, given the presence of France and Germany besides US, does NATO have a role in Indo-Pacific?
All right, that's that's an interesting question. NATO's main charter is Europe. All right, the maximum NATO has come is anti-piracy patrols. And do remember that NATO had ships on patrol, EU had ships on patrol, the CMF had ships on patrol. So a number of European nations, that a few of them, some point in time, I do remember England was one, saying that, listen, I can't give ships for all these things. I've got a very small force. I can give either to one of the task forces or to the other, but not to both. So NATO in itself, especially with the resurgence of Russia, I don't see NATO coming into the Indo-Pacific at all. If it comes, it will be through the EU role model.
Next is, how do we assess the economic element of Indo-Pacific utilizing the existing ASEAN regional framework as balancing a strategy versus the naval aspect of balancing?
If you want to look at economic, then look at it separately. The moment you mix it up with anything military or anything else, it's going to get confused. All right. So you have a number of organizations in the Indo-Pacific. Asia Summit is another. In the Indian Ocean region, let's look at IORA. Nations in all these three groupings are common. So if you're pushing an economic agenda in one forum or one platform, the same agenda then needs to be pushed in the parallel platforms. Then only you will again come back to a certain consensus on economic cooperation. Then again, it depends upon how many nations, say in one particular, say for East Asia Summit. India has a big role to play in East Asia Summit, right? Every 2 years, we hold the Maritime Security Conference of the East Asia Summit in India itself. So there's a big role to play. India has a big role to play in IORA. So if you can be in the driver's seat and if you can get consensus, right, like-minded nations, then you can actually perhaps look at convergences between the various platforms. And I've named three and I'll repeat them again: ASEAN, East Asia Summit, and IORA for that matter. But to my mind, the two main platforms are East Asia Summit and IORA. If these two platforms can work together, exchange ideas, and one bridge that can come about that is the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. That should be able to bridge the gap between IORA and the East Asia Summit and other Indo-Pacific nations. Then we can look at some traction as far as economic cooperation goes.
The next is, what are the linkages between Asia Assurance Initiative Act 2018 and Indo-Pacific strategy unveiled by America? There is a hue and cry in Nepal that there are Millennium Challenge Cooperation, which is under Indo-Pacific strategy, which has military object to Nepal should object this assistance. So what is your take on it?
Well, I can't speak for Nepal, Pramod, you're the expert there, but Nepal finds mention in the strategy report, and it looks at various issues, including military cooperation. I think anti-terrorism is one, and there are a few others out there. So if the strategy only lays out the nice things that this needs to be done, that needs to be done, and in a way, perhaps how to do it also. All right, that would be a plan of action or a policy that follows thereafter. But the money may come from ARIA. So that's an issue that Nepal would have to look at. That if it really wants help from the US as per the strategy document, then ARIA may have to be accepted in some in small doses.
There's another, like, how is Chinese aggression how is Chinese aggression in South China Sea going to affect its relation with the United States? According to you, how is China going to adjust itself with US Indo-Pacific strategy?
That is the crux of the whole presentation, is that they don't see eye to eye. So China, as per the US, China is challenging the existing international rule-based order, the rules-based international system, whatever you may like to call it. China is looking at a very specific thing, is the resurgence of the Chinese dream, and the year they have put it at is 2049, and time is running out for them. Things have not gone as planned for a number of reasons. They have not been able to maintain the timelines which they had planned to do so. So I don't see this any solution to this, because it's very simple. When you have a rising nation, all right, when you have a rising nation, there are two ways of confronting it, or there are two ways of addressing the issue. One is to stand in front and stop it, which means possible conflict, maybe. The other is stand on the side and let it press on, and then accept whatever comes your way. The US was hedging for some time. Again, this is my opinion, and I've asked this question way back in 2010, is that whatever US statements and what US plans to do is good, but it doesn't seem to have effect on China. China still does what it wants to do. So today, if the US is taking a stronger stance of FONOPS, pushing ships there, you know, there are close counters between ships. There have been close counters between aircraft. If you remember, that surveillance aircraft of the US was hit by a Chinese fighter. The US aircraft managed to land, but the Chinese fighter and the pilot were lost. So this is the way it's going to be for a long time to come. I don't see any methodology in which they can actually talk peace. One of them has to back down, and neither of them, I am afraid, are going to do so.
There's another interesting question, that despite the development and advancement made, why does the breach EEZ keep happening? Also about the vessels taken into the sea, are we taking the right step to protect the organisms living in the sea?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Despite the developments and advancements made, why does the breach of exclusive economic zones keep happening? Also, okay, about the vessels taken into sea, are we taking the right step to protect the living organs living in the sea?
So there are two separate issues in this question. EZ has always been a problem. If you read the history of UNCLOS 3 and the discussions and debates that went through it, EZ is a little contentious issue, especially as far as military activities are concerned. But UNCLOS is very clear on protection. What are the rights and duties of a coastal state, of any other state? You know, who has what responsibility and all that. The question is that if, suppose, nation A does not adhere to UNCLOS and enters the EZ of nation B, if nation B does not have the capacity or the capability to challenge it or stop it, there's very little nation B can do. And UNCLOS in any case was based on the principle that nations would follow it in letter and spirit. With dwindling resources, well, of course, there is always, nations would still like to feed their people. And if you read the debate that's happening, the manner in which Chinese fishing vessels are everywhere, and of course there was one I think I read last week where even Pakistani fishermen were not too happy with the entry of Chinese fishing vessels into their waters. So this will happen. And it is for nations to understand that if you've signed a convention, then you need to follow it in letter and spirit. You can have cooperation going on between nations to jointly, you know, to jointly look at the resources that the sea holds for you. And therefore, when you look at life underwater, the SDG 14, which is there, it is precisely that. It addresses that issue. So we need to look at sustainable development, and for that, there's a long road ahead of us to go, right?
There's another question, like, Will Quad formulate in upcoming times? How India would play its role in quadrilateral?
Well, I think when Quad started off, everybody ran too fast. Many people ran too fast and they started calling it the security dialogue. It was never a security dialogue. There is no understanding of security, or there is discussions on security, but to address hardcore security or to form, say, even a loose formation of understanding to address maritime issues or any such issue, it's going to take a long time. The whole issue is the Quad is, we get back to the moot question is, how would you look at the Indo-Pacific? How would you look at the dynamics? You need to have certain convergences, right? And when you look at the last Quad, I'll take you back to say Malabar 2007, when the exercise which I mentioned, where we had 25 ships at sea. You remember the amount of noise China made against it, and therefore finally thereafter we never got again to do it the same exercise again. What stopped us? So the Quad, to my mind, needs to sit together. In fact, there's going to be a Quad meeting of leader. There's going to be a meeting of Quad in India itself shortly, sometime. It's planned. So there is plodding along, but I think Quad needs to connect the dots and see which direction does it need to go. Now, of course, with Abe not there, I really don't know what Japan's stance could be. Australia has been seeing in hardening its stance against China. If you look at the path it has followed against all its white defense papers and statements it's been making recently, especially with the outbreak of COVID. Convergence is required. That's what I would say on maximum issues before Quad can actually become more than just a mere name.
There's another question, which I was talking, like US has America first policy, India has neighborhood first, and you are aware that China and Pakistan are Indian neighbors. Where does America and Indian interest overlap, especially in the context of Indo-Pacific? Similarly, some says America's first is contrary to free and Indo-Pacific as it supports US trade protectionism.
I think part of that question I've already answered earlier, so it's a sort of a repeat on that. Insofar as US and India convergences go, it's been a very rocky path India and the US have followed. When you look at it from independence, there have also been differences between the top leadership. A lot of US presidents didn't get along with the Indian Prime Minister and vice versa. So the essential route is that if the leaders manage to hit it off when they talk, then a lot of stuff can be done. But having said that, today India and US stand on a strategic partnership in which both stand to gain, right? Both stand to gain quite a bit, as long as, and if India plays its cards very well, it can derive maximum benefit from this relationship. And I would say that, I would not say that we are shaking hands with the US because of, say, China, or because Pakistan has fallen out with the US. And this is something that we often debate in the National Maritime Foundation, is that even if Pakistan, China did not exist, India's national interest would have been India's national interest. There would have been no change. If you formulate national interests based on your neighbors, then those are not national interests. So we need to follow our national interests. As long as they are served, we need to shake hands with any nation who we find favor with.
So there's another question, like, why should India, not just like in the past, focus on Indian Ocean region and not the Pacific? Are vested powers dragging us into arena and theaters we are not quite ready or want to perform in?
India has got a vested interest in Western Pacific, by the way. There's a lot of trade of ours that transits through that area. We have investments in oil and gas out there. We have strategic relationships. We have people-to-people contact with that area. So we were, in a way, in a manner, in the past, we were sort of restricted to the Indian Ocean region for a variety of reasons. But now we have the ability to step out, and we must. If you don't step out, there is no way in which India can improve, one, its position in the world, and of course, as a budget, as an economic power. But there is a lot of interest we have in South China Sea. We have investments in oil, we have investments in a lot of things. Business also, you look at the amount of business we do with all those nations out there. It's not, so it's time it's good we stepped out. We've already stepped out. So we need to step out more.
So you just talk about trade. So there's another similar question. What is the scope of maritime dynamics in future relating to trade development in Indo-Pacific region?
That's again a connected question, and my earlier answer also would qualify as a response for this. So trade is trade. There's no doubt about it. And economics has always been the number one driver. Please remember, even in the past, flag has followed trade. So business has gone first. The nation has come thereafter. You look at, say, the British East India Company. I mean, can you imagine they ruled what? England ruled what, two-thirds of the world at one point in time, almost, through all its business ventures and all. So we need to look at trade. That is number one. But also we need to look at how to protect that trade. Physically is one, and nowadays through cyber also.
Another question is related to China, like, is Indo-Pacific going to impact China's Belt and Road Initiative? If yes, how?
That's what I showed you, that map out there. So that is what China is trying to do. It was, I mean, geography has not been kind to the nations in South China Sea, and China is one of them, right? To come out of that area, to reach out to the world, you need to move out of that area. And so far, China has felt stifled in that area. It's not been able to break out. So in order to support its forays out of South China Sea, it needed support infrastructure. That support infrastructure came through via the BRI investments it has done in, say, various ports in various places. Of course, there is now a very severe backlash on certain BRI projects, and we are looking at even along the east coast of Africa. It has happened in many other nations also. So the Indo-Pacific, in a way, is not restricting China. Indo-Pacific again is a region, so it's already reached out to the east coast of. In fact, it's there in Europe also. So these are two separate issues. I don't think we should mix both of them together.
There's another question from a journalist from Nepal. He said, what does Indo-Pacific strategy mean for a country like Nepal?
I was hoping you'd tell me that, Pramod, since when you asked me to speak on Indo-Pacific. But do remember one thing. Even a landlocked nation, and I'm talking from the maritime point of view here, is even for a landlocked nation, UNCLOS gives the provision of the right of access to the sea. And a lot of imports of Nepal come and go by the sea. Whether you take it in and out through India or through Bangladesh, that's a choice Nepal reserves to use itself. And Nepal is an Indo-Pacific nation in a way, maybe landlocked, but it has an important say to, it's an important place in Indo-Pacific, especially coming from the region we are in South Asia. So it's important, but Nepal needs to flesh out for itself what are the low-hanging fruit it can take away from the Indo-Pacific.
Yes, thank you. So actually, I just want to add that Nepal is a part of BIMSTEC now, and through BIMSTEC, Nepal is no longer, it's a landlocked country, but it's not a landlocked region.
Yes.
So we are part of BIMSTEC, and we are connected with Bay of Bengal, and we have access to sea. So when Nepal is a part of BIMSTEC, it's also, it also has the opportunity to connect itself to Indo-Pacific strategy and part of a greater Indo-Pacific region. Another question is like, I want to know about Mauritius leak and how India will break string of pearls.
Mauritius leak?
Leak, L-E-A-K. I don't know about it.
That oil leak that happened is, I assume that is the one.
Okay.
So we have given assistance to Mauritius. We sent our team across. The Coast Guard has sent experts. We have given help to Mauritius as much as we can. And in fact, there were two incidences that happened. One was the ship itself that started sinking and leaking out oil. And then the barge that came to take out the oil from the ship, that also had a sort of accident, and that also caused another small problem for Mauritius. Existence of Mauritius is, the economy is totally on tourism. It's got a large EZ. Fishing is important. So oil slicks will affect others. And so I would say that this Mauritius leak one, and the ship that caught fire off the eastern coast of Sri Lanka, which was carrying oil for India and it was headed to Paradip. There was a fire on board, and India and Sri Lanka got together and we managed to address it. But as of yesterday, I had read again that there was a fire had broken out, so further leakage may be there. But we have the Indian Coast Guard on site, we have the Sri Lankan Navy on site, and they're doing a commendable job. And this is what I say is a good example of regional cooperation.
So I still have like around 20-25 questions, but let's end with the last question.
Okay.
Why Quad is not formally formalized yet? Let me read it. Why Quad is not formally formed yet? What it would, the role of India in it? What would be the role of India in it? How would it serve India's national interest?
I think I've already answered that question. So they need to look at convergence issues. We need to look at certain bases on which you can work together as quad. And but my view again here is that security would be one of them, and perhaps one of the last to be looked at. We need to look at economic convergences, and other issues are much easier than security related issues.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your time. We really learned a lot, and we hope to have you again to talk on similar issues in future. We'd also like to thank all our participants for their time and the questions. Please join us to our upcoming events in future. Hope to see you soon. Thank you. Thank you very much.